It began with a scent, a passing breeze that shouldn't have carried anything more than the pine's resinous breath, and the damp earth of early October carried death. The hiker had wandered off trail by accident, the kind of mistake made when headphones distract more than guide. He wasn't looking for trouble. But when the wind shifted and the smell hit him a sickly sweet rot that overpowered the forest's natural perfume, he froze. At first he thought it might be a dead animal, a deer perhaps, or a bear carcass left behind by some poacher. But as he followed the smell, half curious, half compelled, what he found was something no one should stumble upon alone. The cabin appeared like a memory out of nowhere, half-rotted, overtaken by moss and leaning slightly like it had grown tired of holding its own secrets. No trail led to it, no tire marks, no signs of visitors. It stood there, crumbling in slow, forgotten silence. The hiker's breath grew shallow as he stepped onto the warped porch. The door creaked not as a warning, but like a sigh. And inside was the body. She was curled in a fetal position, clothed but shoeless, skin pale gray and matted with mildew. Her hands were folded under her chin, as if she had died praying, or protecting herself from something the cabin couldn't keep out. There was no blood, no weapon, no ID, no bag, no phone, no name. Only the body, the smell, and the silence. A silence that would soon be interrupted by the arrival of the Oregon State Police. Detective Clara Reese was used to noise crime scenes with cameras clicking radios, squawking people shouting for tape or gloves or light. But this one was eerily quiet. Even the coroner spoke in half-whispers, like raising your voice might wake something. "There's no trauma," he told her, lifting the woman's arm gently. "No bruising, no lacerations, no needle marks. You'd think she just laid down and stopped living." Reese looked around the single-room cabin. A broken stove, a rusted cot, empty cans stacked neatly in a corner, and in the middle of it all, her, a woman no one knew in a place no one visited. She bent down near the body, scanning for anything that might hint at identity: jewelry, tattoos, scars. There was nothing, not even calluses on the fingers. Her skin was worn soft, untouched by labor or violence. "You think she died here?" one officer asked. Reese nodded slowly. "Yes, and not recently." That night, the forensics team bagged everything: hair strands, dust samples, even the mold on the walls. They removed the body with care, but even in the van, she still seemed present, like her silence clung to everything it touched. Back at the precinct, the search for identity began. Prints were lifted and uploaded, dental records scanned, DNA rushed to the lab. Reese stood before the whiteboard, writing in large letters, "Unidentified female, cabin 41.7756 Degen, 121.87 from DW." The coordinates pointed to nowhere. A forest stretch just west of Klamath Falls, untouched since timber licenses were revoked in the late 90s. No cell towers, no mail routes, no reason for anyone, especially not a woman in her 20s, to be there. Why there? Why alone? Why like this? 3 days passed, then a week, and still no hits. Reese stared at the screen in the lab, watching the system churn through database after database. CODIS, NAMUS, even Interpol. The computer blinked back at her with the same persistent response: no matches found. It was as if the woman had never existed. No arrest records, no DMV data, no dental history, no bank activity. She had no presence in the system, and that was what made Reese pause. Even runaways had traces. Even undocumented victims had scars. This woman had none. On the 10th day, a second autopsy confirmed what Reese feared: no natural cause of death. The woman's organs were intact, but oddly slowed. Toxicology was clean. No sign of overdose, no blunt force trauma, no asphyxiation. It was almost as if she had chosen to die, or been made to die in a way that left no visible trace. She was preserved, the medical examiner whispered. Not embalmed, but her body's stillness, it's unnatural. She was kept cold, maybe underground, maybe in storage, then brought here. Then why here, Reese asked. The examiner stared at the wall for a moment. Maybe because this cabin doesn't belong to anyone. Because nobody would find her. Because silence leaves no fingerprints. That night, Reese returned to the cabin alone. She sat on the floor where the body had been feeling the musty air fill her lungs. There was no wind, no birds, no insects, just the slow creak of the roof above her, and the unsettling feeling that someone had been watching her all along. Not just the hiker, not just the killer, but the cabin itself. And in that moment she realized the story wasn't about the body. It was about everything the silence refused to tell. The woman had no name, no origin, no traceable past. Her fingerprints examined 3 times under high-resolution comparison software matched no record in any state or federal database. The DNA sample, which took 6 days to process through CODIS, yielded no familial hits, not even a second cousin. To the system, she was a ghost. Detective Clara Reese had handled cold cases before long-forgotten files in dusty drawers, mugshots faded into sepia leads gone stale from neglect. But this wasn't a cold case. This was a fresh body with a dead trail, a mystery that had arrived already buried. She stood in the forensic lab watching the techs work with a level of urgency normally reserved for active shooters or abductions. But even they were beginning to lose steam. There was only so much to extract from someone who had left no imprint on the world. She could be undocumented, one technician offered. A traveler, a runaway, hell, maybe even off-grid. Even off-grid people leave crumbs, Reese said, shaking her head. You buy food, get a rash, take something for it. You see a vet, a mechanic, a gas station, someone, somewhere. The problem wasn't just the silence, it was the perfection of it. No one was that invisible, except perhaps by design. The cabin offered no leads. Ownership records showed the structure had once belonged to a logging company dissolved in 1993. Since then, it had been left to rot. A single trespassing report had been filed in 2004. A hunter had been found sleeping inside. No name was recorded. No follow-up. Reese ordered a full sweep of the surrounding 5 miles. Drones, bloodhounds, ground-penetrating radar. Nothing came back. No discarded belongings, no drag marks, no tire tracks. The place was clean. Too clean. This wasn't where she died, the field agent said flatly. She was placed here. Reese nodded. She had known it since the first night. Still, it stung to hear it aloud. Someone had taken the time to preserve her, transport her, position her, and then disappear. 10 days after discovery, the coroner assigned the case a temporary label, Jane Doe 04180. Reese hated those names. Jane Doe. It sounded clinical, detached. But as she stared at the woman's file, it was the only truth they had. Age estimated 23 to 27. Height 5'6". Weight 124 pounds. Ethnicity ambiguous. Caucasian with possible Latin admixture. No birthmarks. No surgical history. No piercings. Teeth in perfect alignment. Likely orthodontic work in her teens. That was something. Braces meant a dentist. Braces meant parents, someone who once cared. Yet no one had reported her missing. Reese launched a secondary query. She widened the timeline, looked at every woman between the ages of 18 and 30, reported missing in the last 15 years across North America. The list was long. Too long. Still, she read through every name. Nothing matched. That night, Reese stayed in her office. The building emptied around her. Lights clicked off one row at a time until only hers remained. She spread photographs across her desk. The victim's hands, the texture of her jeans, the fibers found in her hair. She played with timelines. Where had the girl been before she died? How had she ended up in Oregon? There had to be something they missed. A thread. At 2:43 a.m. she saw it. A photograph from the third crime scene sweep a wide shot of the cabin's interior. Most eyes would focus on the corpse, the rusted stove, the shadows on the wall. But Reese's eyes locked on something smaller, a ring, not on the girl's fingers, on the floor beneath the stove. She hadn't seen it during the on-site investigation. Neither had forensics. It must have been knocked loose during the body's removal, a glint of metal half hidden in dust. She drove back out at dawn. The ring was still there, silver, tarnished, with an inscription on the inside band. Reese squinted in the growing light to read it. AP to MD Montreal 2011. A name, or at least initials, a city and a year. Reese held her breath. A breath that for the first time in days didn't smell like decay or frustration. A breath that carried hope. She photographed the ring, bagged it, and drove straight to the precinct. She logged into the Canadian Missing Persons database, something rarely used in local Oregon PDs, and typed in a new filter. Female Montreal disappeared after 2011. 17 results. 12 were still active cases. 3 had DNA on file, no match. 2 had incomplete data. 1 had a face that looked hauntingly familiar. The file was for a woman named Marianne Ducharme, reported missing in 2012 by a former roommate. She had left no note, no explanation. Vanished from her apartment, leaving behind a passport, a phone, and a half-packed suitcase. No foul play suspected. The roommate had mentioned a boyfriend initials AP, whom no one ever tracked down. The case went cold in 2013. Reese stared at Marianne's photograph. A university student with warm brown eyes and the hint of a dimple that never fully formed. She looked peaceful, curious, alive. Reese opened the image file of the woman from the cabin and placed them side by side. Same jawline, same left eyebrow with a slight arch, same small mole above the collarbone. It had to be her. She sent the photos to facial recognition for confirmation. Then she waited. 2 days later, the results came in. 97.6% probability match. Jane Doe 04180 was not a ghost. She was Marianne Ducharme, and she had been missing for 12 years. But the question remained, where had she been all that time, and why had she come back just to die? The image floated across the old detective's desk like a ghost long overdue. Detective Arthur Keene had retired 5 years ago, but retirement was a misleading word. He hadn't stopped working. He had simply stopped getting paid. His office, nestled above a dusty convenience store in suburban Toronto, was wallpapered with yellowed clippings and faces that hadn't made it home. Some solved, some stubbornly unsolved. A shrine to stories unfinished. When the image landed in his inbox, forwarded by an old contact in the Ontario Provincial Police, he nearly deleted it. Another cold case, another false hope. But something in the subject line caught his eye. Possible match. Montreal, 2012. He clicked, waited, and there she was, the girl from 12 years ago. The one who'd haunted his dreams and mocked his dead ends. Marianne Ducharme. He leaned forward, comparing the new image. Her face pale, silent, forever, still with the younger, vibrant version that had once been pinned on his precinct's wall. There was no denying it. That was her. The same dimple, the same slight misalignment in her bottom teeth. But what was she doing in Oregon? Keene rubbed his temple. His old files weren't digital. They lived in boxes, folders, and coffee-stained manila envelopes. He pulled the file from the cabinet labeled MN. Marianne's case hadn't gotten much traction back then. A missing university student. No clear signs of foul play. No blood. No struggle. Her phone had been found in her apartment wiped. Her last known sighting was blurry footage of her entering a downtown bus terminal at 9:32 p.m. on a Thursday night. After that, nothing. No ticket, no destination. Her roommate had mentioned a boyfriend, Alexandre Perrault, art student, soft-spoken, vaguely intense, never officially named a suspect, but something about him always sat wrong with Keene. The guy vanished 2 weeks after Marianne. No forwarding address, no goodbye, gone like a vapor. No one cared much back then. College kids disappear, start over, OD, get lost. Marianne became another file in the drawer, the kind detectives tell themselves they'll revisit one day. Now that day had come. Keene picked up the phone. Clara Reese answered on the second ring. She had been sleeping, though she wouldn't admit it. The Oregon Trail had gone cold again, and the confirmation of Marianne's identity had only deepened the mystery. "Detective Reese?" the voice said gravelly but alert. "Yes, who's this?" "Arthur Keene, former detective, Toronto PD. I worked Marianne Ducharme's case back in 2012. I've seen the image. It's her." Reese sat up. "I believe so too. But I'm still piecing together what happened between then and now." "So am I," Keene said. "Listen, her boyfriend, Alexandre Perrault. He went missing shortly after she did. Never found. I suspected he was involved, but had nothing solid. Now I think he might be the key." Reese paused. "You think he killed her?" "No," Keene said. "I think he tried to disappear with her, and maybe failed." Reese requested access to the archived case files from Toronto PD. Keene, who still had backdoor contacts, sent scanned copies from his own records. There was one thing that stood out more than any fingerprint or alibi: a sketch. Back in 2013, a cafe owner had claimed she saw Marianne or someone who looked like her 6 months after the official disappearance. The sighting had never been confirmed, but the cafe owner had described her vividly. She had short hair then, and a scarf, but the eyes, it was her. She seemed nervous, like she didn't want to be seen. Keene had commissioned a sketch from a police artist. It had gathered dust for a decade. When Reese saw it, her breath caught, because it didn't match the corpse in the cabin. Not entirely. The face was thinner, the posture tighter. But the real difference was the scar. Across the left cheekbone, a faint but unmistakable line. Reese zoomed into the photograph of the cabin body. No scar. She checked again. Nothing. What did that mean? Had the cafe owner been wrong? Or had the woman seen someone else? Someone trying to look like Marianne? Reese called Keene again. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked. "That maybe the girl in the sketch wasn't Marianne?" Keene replied, "Yes, and if she wasn't." Reese continued slowly, "Then someone else was pretending to be her, meaning the person who died in that cabin might not have been Marianne Ducharme." Keene exhaled. "You ever heard of an identity hijack?" Reese had. Cases where women fleeing abuse or fugitives escaping surveillance assume the identity of someone missing. It's easier than inventing a new one. You don't have to create a paper trail, just borrow someone else's that's already gone cold. Say Marianne did run away, Keene said. Say she and Perrault had a plan. And say someone else, someone from later, found out about it and used her name, her story. Then who the hell died in my cabin? Reese asked. There was silence on the line. Then Keene said, and where's the real Marianne? Reese stood in her office surrounded by maps. One marked with the path from Montreal to Oregon, another tracing small towns along the Canadian border. She remembered the ring, the inscription, AP to MD. That inscription assumed a love story, a gift. But now, it felt like a breadcrumb from someone who wanted to be found. She opened the evidence locker and pulled out the ring again. This time she looked at the engraving under a different light. The carving was too clean, too fresh. Not 13 years old. The ring had been made recently. Someone wanted them to think it belonged to Marianne, but it didn't. It was a setup. The silence had never been passive. It had been designed. 12 years. That's how long Marianne Ducharme had been missing. Long enough for the world to forget. Long enough for grief to turn into dust in the back of a file cabinet. And yet now her name was everywhere again. On case files, on email threads, across agencies in 2 countries. But something didn't fit. The woman in the cabin looked like Marianne, but not quite. The features matched. The height, the jawline, the mole above the collarbone, all consistent. But there were anomalies. No scar. Dental records that almost aligned, but didn't. Slight differences. Off by just enough. Clara Reese reviewed the 2012 autopsy photos of Marianne's dental x-rays, then compared them to the new remains. 3 molars had shifted. 1 had a different filling. Nothing definitive, but together they whispered a truth louder than any shout. This was not the same person. Someone had tried very hard to make her seem like Marianne, and for nearly 2 weeks everyone had believed them. Reese sat alone with the new information, staring at the board covered in yarn and pins. The photo of the body was now labeled Subject X. Marianne's name, once underlined, now bore a question mark. The timeline had split. 2 paths, 1 girl, 2 disappearances. She started building a theory. In 2012, Marianne goes missing. Her boyfriend, Alexandre Perrault, vanishes days later. Neither are found. Years pass, and then someone shows up bearing a near-identical face, dies silently, in an abandoned Oregon cabin, wearing a ring inscribed with names that might be fake. But why? Who would want to become someone like Marianne? A missing person, not a celebrity. A quiet college student, not a fugitive or heiress. What was there to gain? Unless the goal wasn't to become Marianne. It was to hide inside her absence. In a rented room above a diner off I-5, Reese reviewed the full Canadian Missing Persons Registry again. This time she filtered not for resemblance, but for connection. Women missing between 2015 and 2020. Women with a history of abuse. Women last seen heading west. She cross-referenced those names with shelters, halfway houses, border crossings. Then she found her, Emily Sorensen. Disappeared from a shelter in Spokane, Washington in 2018. Age 22. No family. Fleeing an abusive partner. Last seen boarding a bus with cash, no ID, and dyed black hair. Shelter staff described her as reserved, smart, and always asking about fake identities. Reese pulled up the photo. It was the woman in the cabin. Not Marianne. Emily. The breakthrough twisted everything. Emily had disappeared once from her life, then again from her death. Someone had found her, convinced her to assume the identity of another missing woman. Perhaps it was a mutual arrangement, or perhaps someone coerced her into it. But why choose Marianne? Reese revisited the old sketches. She dug into the name Alexandre Perrault, the mysterious boyfriend who vanished with Marianne. No tax records, no social media, no family ties. But one match came up on a flagged customs report from 2016, a man using a Canadian passport under the name Alain Petrovsky, traveling between Vancouver and Bogota, Colombia. The initials matched. AP, the same ones on the ring. She checked the signature on the customs form. The P was drawn the same way, a distinctive upward curl at the top. It was him. Alexandre had resurfaced, but not in Canada. in Colombia. That opened a floodgate. Interpol logs revealed a minor investigation in Medellin in 2019, tied to a suspected trafficking network run through missionary fronts. One of the persons of interest, a man matching Perot's description using a rotating list of aliases, fluent in French, known for targeting vulnerable young women. Reese's chest tightened. Was Marianne alive? And part of it, or had she become one of its victims? Either way, Emily Sorensen had crossed paths with someone who wanted her gone, who had perhaps offered her safety under a borrowed name only to erase her when she outlived her usefulness, and they had chosen to bury her in silence. In a cabin no one visited, wearing a ring that told a lie. Reese flew to Toronto to meet Arthur Keene in person. His office hadn't changed, still cluttered with maps and case files, still bathed in that stale warmth of obsession. She wasn't Marianne, she told him. Keene nodded solemnly. I thought so. She was Emily. Someone used Marianne's identity as a mask, probably to move her, maybe to traffic her, or to hide her. And now, Keene asked, now she's dead. And I think someone wanted us to stop asking why. They sat in silence for a while. Then Keene leaned forward and tapped a folder on the desk. You ever wonder what happens to the real Marianne? Reese stared at the folder. I don't think she's dead, she whispered. I think she became something worse. A ghost hiding inside her own grave. Back in Oregon, Reese reopened the case under a new name, Emily Sorensen Homicide, Multinational Investigation. And in a box marked Evidence Cabin Scene, she placed the silver ring not as a symbol of love, but as a confession, forged in silence. The girl in the woods hadn't disappeared once. She had disappeared twice, and only now was someone finally listening. The video was grainy, pulled from a rusted surveillance camera at a truck stop on the outskirts of Redding, California, a 3-hour drive south of the Oregon border. The footage had nearly been overwritten before Reese requested it. Old files didn't last long unless someone knew exactly what to look for. But someone had looked. It showed a woman, unmistakably Emily Sorensen, stepping out of the passenger side of a long-haul truck. Her movements were tentative, her shoulders tight. She looked behind her twice. Then a moment later, a man stepped down from the driver's side. He moved differently. There was something deliberate about the way he carried his body, cautious but rigid, as if every muscle had learned to resist gravity in its own way. He didn't speak to Emily, didn't touch her. He simply nodded once as she walked toward the restroom, then stood by the truck, arms crossed. The camera caught his profile briefly, late 30s, thick beard, baseball cap pulled low. Reese froze the frame. She'd seen that posture before. The arms folded, head slightly tilted to one side, a gesture not of boredom, but of calculation. It was the same posture captured in an Interpol watch list photo from 3 years earlier. Alias Joaquin Reyes. Nationality Colombian. No verified real name. Connected loosely to a missionary trafficking ring dismantled in Bogotá. Never charged. Believed to be fluent in English and French. Rumored to have suffered a severe throat injury in 2014 left him mute. He was known on the black market as El Silencio, the man with no voice. It was hard to interrogate someone who couldn't speak. Harder still to prosecute someone who never left fingerprints. Reese started pulling every known sighting of El Silencio across the last 5 years. Border entries, customs scans, satellite imagery. His pattern was slow but wide. He moved women from shelters to borders, from Canada to Colombia, from hope to silence. And now it seemed he had moved Emily. The real question was whether Emily had gone willingly, whether she thought he was her protector or her captor. At the truck stop, the footage showed Emily returning from the restroom. She hesitated near a vending machine, looked up toward the sky, then walked back to the truck. but not before slipping something into the side panel of a newspaper rack. Reese had the rack removed and examined. Wedged deep behind the panel was a wrapper, and inside it, folded small, was a strip of paper barely wider than a thumb. It read in all caps, "If he stops for gas again, I'll run." It was dated 5 days before her body was found. She had been planning to escape. Reese's breathing grew heavier. Emily had tried to leave. She had been searching for a moment any window of exit. The note meant she knew she was in danger. It meant her death had not been a random end, but the collapse of a quiet rebellion. Reese tracked down the truck. It had been sold and resold under dummy companies registered in Nevada and Mexico. Layers of shell corporations made tracing the ownership a bureaucratic nightmare. But one name appeared consistently on the maintenance logs: A. Petrovsky. The alias tied to Alexandre Perrault. 2 ghosts. 1 truck. Emily had been shuttled between silence and silence. There was one more lead, a service station in Bend, Oregon, where the same truck had been seen 2 days before the cabin discovery. The clerk remembered nothing about the man, didn't speak, just paid in cash. But she remembered the girl. She was quiet, the clerk said. Didn't make eye contact. Bought mints. Left a $5 bill on the counter. Reese pulled the register drawer. Taped beneath the coin slot was another note. Cabin North, mile 219. It wasn't much, but it was a message. Left behind like a breadcrumb. Emily had been trying to send signals, not screaming, not running, just leaving pieces. She was running in slow motion, hoping someone would catch her trajectory before it ended. Someone almost had, but almost wasn't enough. The autopsy report had stated Emily's cause of death as cardiac arrest with unknown trigger. No physical trauma, no poison, no organ failure. But now, with this context, Reese knew what had killed her. It wasn't silence. It was the weight of carrying it alone. Whatever El Silencio had done, whatever Alexandre had built it, relied on erasing women like Emily. Moving them, reshaping them, silencing them in name and in body. Marianne had been the perfect ghost, missing pretty unclaimed. Emily had been perfect too, until she decided to stop being a shadow. Reese stared at a map of truck routes between Spokane and Bend. There were dozens, but only one veered through a stretch of private forestry roads, the same one that led near the abandoned cabin. She pinned the route in red. At every stop, she listed the potential cameras, clerks, bystanders, and at every stop she added a name: El Silencio Suspect. Not just a handler, a killer. The last confirmed sighting of the man was 2 days after Emily's body was found, crossing the border south through El Paso using a temporary freight license under another alias. He hadn't said a word, but Reese didn't need his voice anymore. She had Emily's, and this time she would speak. The rail yard had been abandoned for years, a rusted skeleton of a once busy interchange where freight trains carried timber and gravel from Oregon's high country to the coast. Now it sat in silence. Overgrown tracks, shattered windows, storage sheds where raccoons nested, and rusted tanks long emptied of fuel. But the dog didn't hesitate. His name was Rocco, a 5-year-old Belgian Malinois trained for human scent tracking. Reese had worked with him before, years back, on a missing child case near Klamath Falls. He had a stubbornness that bordered on arrogant, but he was sharp, almost surgical, when something caught his nose. Rocco had been brought in to retrace Emily's last days. The trail from the service station had faded, but the cabin still carried traces on fabric, on soil, on air. The handlers gave him a cloth taken from the jeans Emily wore when she was found. The dog sniffed it once, twice, then turned sharply toward the forest's edge. What should have been a minor sweep, a formality, became something else entirely. Rocco led them through 2 miles of underbrush across a shallow creek and into the south end of the old Woodbury rail depot, a place not even Reese had thought to revisit. It had no direct line to the cabin, no recent signs of activity. But Rocco stopped cold at the threshold of a small supply shed near the switching yard. He sat. He whined. Then he scratched at the door. The shed's lock was new, too new. Reese signaled for bolt cutters. Inside, the air was thick, metallic. The room was maybe 10 feet across, with a rotted desk in the corner and a rusted sink detached from the wall. But it wasn't empty. On the floor sat a gray plastic storage bin, the kind used for camping supplies or workshop tools. It was sealed tight. They pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a black tarp, was a duffel bag. Inside the bag were clothes, women's clothes, jeans, t-shirts, bras, shoes, a small paperback novel, Les Miserables French edition, and a journal. Reese's hands trembled as she flipped the cover open. It wasn't just any notebook. The first page had a name written in careful cursive, Marianne Ducharme. The journal had water damage. Several pages were smeared illegible, but others had survived. Entries were dated sporadically. 2014, 2016, 2018. No mention of locations, only emotions. Fragments. We moved again. He says it's for our safety, but I no longer know who's watching whom. I miss real coffee. I miss my name. Emily cried again tonight. I think she knows I'm not free either. Reese's breath caught. Emily and Marianne, together, alive somewhere, at least at some point. One more entry scribbled sideways along the margin. Silence isn't safety, it's strategy. But even silence cracks. DNA from the bra confirmed what Reese had begun to suspect. Marianne Ducharme had at some point been alive inside that shed. Her scent lingered in the air even if her body didn't. But she wasn't there now. The tracks near the door showed a large vehicle, probably the same truck used to transport Emily. But the prints were old. Weeks, maybe months. Whoever had used this place had been meticulous. They had chosen a dead spot, a gap between surveillance zones, a place even the dogs wouldn't have gone unless they remembered a scent no human could follow. Rocco's alert had turned a cold case into a live one. The discovery changed the investigation's nature from a homicide to an ongoing conspiracy. Multiple victims, multiple aliases, a trafficking network that didn't just hide people, it erased and rebuilt them. Reese filed for a joint task force extension crossing state and national borders now felt inevitable. She briefed the Department of Homeland Security, who had flagged a similar network operating under Religious Front charities from Bogota to Dallas, and somewhere in those routes, the name Petrovsky appeared again, always fleeting, always one step ahead. Reese reviewed everything again. The truck stop note, the ring, the shed, the journal. A pattern began to emerge, not one of chaos, but of careful manipulation. Each woman had a role, a story, a shelf life, and when the story expired, so did the girl. But Marianne's story hadn't expired. Not yet. The journal was recent, no older than 2 years, which meant she was either still alive, or her death was newer than they thought, or perhaps, just perhaps, she was no longer a victim. The more Reese read the journal, the more the tone shifted. Early entries were fearful, apologetic, but later ones were colder, strategic, detached. I watch him when he sleeps. I count how long he stops breathing. She still thinks we're friends, but I don't know if I ever was. Silence is contagious. Once you hold it, it holds you. Reese felt a chill she hadn't known since her academy days. This wasn't the voice of someone held captive. This was the voice of someone adapting and possibly controlling. Had Marianne turned? Had she gone from prey to something more complex? Rocco sniffed near another structure, but no further evidence was found that day. Still, his alert had opened a door that could no longer be closed. Back at headquarters, Reese sat with the journal and whispered aloud. "What do you know that we don't?" The dog had known. He had followed something unspoken, invisible. Now it was Reese's turn to do the same, because beneath the silence, Something was speaking, and it was time to listen. They searched the house in silence, as if afraid to disturb the memories hiding in the walls. Located on the outskirts of Crescent City, California, tucked between a logging trail and a dried-up creek, the house had no official owner. Property records pointed to an LLC dissolved 3 years ago. No name, no taxes paid, no real history. But the utilities had been active. Low usage, consistent payments made through prepaid cards, no internet, just electricity, enough for one person, maybe two. Reese stood on the porch as the lock clicked open. The air inside was stale, not with dust, but with deliberation. The kind of stillness created not by abandonment, but by discipline. They moved room by room, sparse furniture, no photos, no books, no dishes in the sink. But there were signs of life, faint, almost hidden. A teacup with a chipped handle, a loose board under the floor revealing a stash of passports. 5 all under different names, all women, all missing. One bore the name Emily Sorensen. Another Marie Duchesne, eerily close to Marianne Ducharme. But the most unsettling discovery was in the bedroom closet. A box of cassette tapes. Reese sat on the floor, gloved hands carefully removing the first tape. The labels were handwritten in pencil dates, some stretching back over a decade. Others had no date at all, just initials, or nothing. She found a battery-powered tape player in the same box. Cheap, dusty, functional. She pressed play. The sound began with static, then breathing, shaky, close to the mic. Then a voice. I don't remember what my real name was. The voice was female. Soft, uncertain. Not Emily. Not the Marianne from the news clips. This was someone else. Someone already fractured. I was told I could start over. That the past didn't matter. But I dream about the girl I used to be. Click, end of tape. Reese loaded the second one. This time the voice was clearer, different. You have to forget them. That's the first rule. No names, no photos, no mirrors. Another voice interrupts. A man's voice, muffled, authoritative. Say it again. I am no one. Again. I am no one. Click. There were 27 tapes. Reese listened to 8 before she had to step outside for air. Each one was a confession or something closer to indoctrination. Women describing their memories, being asked to repeat phrases, renounce names, practice silence. This wasn't just trafficking. It was erasure. A system built not to smuggle, but to reprogram. But then came the 9th tape. Different tone, sharper clarity. A voice Reese recognized. Marianne, or at least the woman who once went by that name. I knew they would come, she said. I left them enough pieces, breadcrumbs they'd call it, but I wasn't leading them back to me. She paused, then continued. I was leading them to the monster. That single sentence changed everything. Marianne had been part of it willingly or not, but she had also turned. Turned on the system, turned on the handler, turned on the man with no voice. She had begun leaving signs. The ring, the journal, the coordinates in the note at the gas station. She wasn't running anymore. She was pointing, but she had done it in a way that protected herself, cloaked in ambiguity, one step ahead of everyone, even those trying to save her. Inside the box, Reese found one final tape labeled for her in red ink. It was undated. She hesitated, then played it. Emily, the voice, began. You said you wanted to be free, that you wanted to stop pretending. I didn't stop you. I watched you leave the truck stop and place that note. I knew he'd find it. And I knew what that meant. A pause. I'm sorry. A breath. Heavy. Controlled. Freedom isn't a place. It's a cost. And you were willing to pay it. I wasn't. The tape ended there. Reese stared at the player, the last note hanging in the stale room like smoke from a fire long gone. Emily had tried to escape. Marianne had let her, but not without consequence. Later that evening, Reese sat in her car outside the house. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long, sharp shadows across the hood. She looked again at the map. The cabin, the rail yard, the service station, the house. It wasn't a triangle. It was a route, a corridor of control, and Marianne had walked it more than once. Back at the station, Reese transferred the tapes to digital. Voice analysis began. The techs isolated background sounds, a train horn in one, a rooster crowing in another, maybe nothing, maybe clues. Interpol requested copies, so did Homeland Security, but Reese kept the final tape, the one marked for her, in her desk drawer, not as evidence, but as a reminder that some voices survive even the deepest silences, and sometimes the only thing louder than truth. Ed is a whisper. The box was discovered behind a false wall in the basement of the Crescent City house, tucked between insulation boards, sealed in waxed linen, as if time itself had been asked to keep a secret. There were 37 letters each, handwritten, folded carefully into faded envelopes. None had been mailed. No stamps, no postmarks, but each was addressed, all to the same person. Isabela Durán, calle 6, número 13A27, Bogotá, Colombia. Reese sat on the concrete floor, gloves on, reading by flashlight. The letters were dated, most falling between 2015 and 2019, all written in French with occasional Spanish phrases tucked into margins. The handwriting was consistent, controlled, elegant, almost scholarly. They began simply. Ma chère Isabella, you don't know me, but I knew your sister once, before we became ghosts. Each letter unveiled more. Names were omitted. Locations coded. The tone veered between intimate and encrypted, the voice of someone speaking across oceans and borders to a person they could never safely meet. Reese didn't recognize the name at first, but the name Duran had come up once, buried in the Interpol file from Bogotá. A woman connected to a charity raid in 2017 listed as a missing witness. That woman was Isabella's sister, and that charity was a missionary front used to launder women across borders from Colombia to Canada, through shelters, churches, freight trucks, and somewhere along that chain, Emily Sorensen, Marianne Ducharme, possibly many more. The sixth letter chilled Reese more than any tape. I wanted to tell her to run, but that would have made me a target too, so I taught her silence. I taught her how to vanish. She was a quick learner. Sometimes I fear I taught her too well. There was no signature. But the voice was unmistakable now. Marianne had written these, to someone she had never met, but to whom she owed something. Guilt, perhaps, or a debt of survival. The language changed in the later letters. Shorter sentences, sharper edges. By 2018, the writer had stopped addressing Isabella directly. The letters became more like logs, unsent journal entries. He's starting to forget who we were before this. He thinks I still love him. I smile when he says it. That smile is a weapon now. Emily asked me about Bogotá. She asked about you. I told her there were places no one escapes from twice. Reese stopped reading. It wasn't just a story of survival anymore. It was a calculated undoing. Marianne had been planting seeds for years. Messages, notes, letters, tapes, none of them mailed, none of them sent, but all of them meant to be found when the time was right. In the final letter, Marianne wrote, "The monster doesn't kill with his hands. He kills with time, with distance, with versions of yourself he teaches you to erase. But monsters forget. Silence is patient, and one day it learns to scream." There was a small drawing beneath those lines, a sketch of a girl standing on a cliff, her mouth open but no sound drawn. Only lines like heat waves, or radio waves, or maybe just maybe echoes. Reese contacted the Colombian embassy. The address matched a tenement in Bogotá's La Candelaria district. No one named Isabella lived there anymore, but a neighbor confirmed the name. Yes, Isabella had lived there. Yes, her sister had disappeared after joining a church outreach group. Yes, some white man used to visit her. Then no one did. The neighbor said one more thing. A woman once came asking about Isabella. A tall woman. Quiet. Spoke fluent Spanish. Bought coffee but didn't drink it. Said her name was Marie. Interpol opened a new line of inquiry. A task force was reactivated. But for Reese, this wasn't a jurisdictional matter anymore. It was a moral one. Somewhere between Oregon, Columbia, and a box of unsent letters, a woman had mapped the architecture of a criminal empire, not with blueprints or testimonies, but with memory. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. She had written, and now those words would move faster than any truck, any handler, any man who thought he could outlive silence. Reese placed the box in evidence, sealed and catalogued. She made 2 copies, one for Interpol, one for the DHS. But the original, she kept near her desk. Not because it was critical, because it was human, because in 37 letters that never reached their destination, there was something more powerful than proof. There was intent, and intent, she realized, was what kept Marianne alive. Not in body that was still in question, but in purpose, in choice, and maybe in vengeance. From the outside, it looked like a nightclub, flashing lights, thumping reggaeton, a long line of tourists and locals weaving down the block in northern Bogotá. The sign above the door read, Luz del Sur, in pink neon flickering every few seconds, as if trying to forget its own name. But underneath the music, the laughter, and the false glamour was something else, something sacred, or once sacred, a church buried beneath concrete and darkness, the remnants of an old Spanish-era foundation, decommissioned, sold, gutted, and repurposed. It had no pulpit anymore, no altar, but the bones of its structure remained. Stone arches, a collapsed bell tower, and a tunnel that led to a chamber with no windows. That chamber was not on any blueprint. Yet it was there that the women were taken, at least according to a set of coordinates found in the margin of Marianne's 12th letter, a latitude, a longitude, a whisper left for those who would listen, and Reese was listening. Interpol and Colombian authorities launched a raid in the early hours of a humid Friday. The club was operating at half capacity, a slow night. The patrons were herded outside. The music was cut. In the basement, a locked steel door led to a set of stone steps covered in mildew and history. What they found was not what they expected. No cages, no victims, just a room filled with documents. Boxes and boxes of intake forms. Names, dates, transfer records, all written by hand, all in code. Dozens of passports, half-burnt photos, audio recorders, and in the center, a cross, upright, wooden, scarred by fire. On it, pinned with a rusted nail, was a note. This is not a sanctuary. This is the stage. It was signed M.D. Marianne. Reese arrived on the next flight. The scene had already been processed, but the room lingered with a chill that no evidence bag could contain. She stood in the middle of the chamber, listening not to the silence, but to the resonance beneath it. Because this was more than a room. It was a memory. A monument to suffering masquerading as structure, and it had been built to entertain. The documents revealed a chilling pattern. Women were selected through shelters, churches, retreat programs. They were brought here told they'd be protected, fed, restored, then assigned new identities, often those of the already missing. From there, they were exported like commodities. To Canada, to the U.S., some stayed in Bogotá, some vanished entirely. The forms were all signed under one name, Father Alain. The alias matched an Interpol red notice tied to Alexandre Perrault. But even more disturbing than the ledgers were the recordings. Reese sat in a makeshift command post above ground headphones on, listening to tape after tape. They weren't confessions. They were performances. Girls rehearsing lines, crying on cue, speaking in scripts. My name is Marianne. I came from Montreal. I was taken at 22. Another voice, same phrases. Then another. My name is Emily. I was born in Washington. I was lost. It wasn't trafficking. It was theater. They had turned trauma into choreography, molded women into reenactments of real disappearances. Like actors playing victims too convincingly to break character, only one tape stood apart. The voice was calm, older. There's a story people believe about light, that it purifies, reveals, heals. But light is also a weapon. It blinds, it burns, and in this place it hides the devil under a disco ball. If you're hearing this, I am gone, but he is not. You'll know him when he says nothing. Reese clenched her jaw. El silencio. Still out there, still watching. They found no bodies beneath the club, but they found evidence of many. Flakes of blood under tiles, hair strands sealed inside plaster, a single gold earring embedded in the concrete. The message was clear: the club was never meant to last. It was meant to burn or vanish, and someone, maybe Marianne, had ensured that it didn't. She had left just enough before the fire, just enough before the fall. As authorities processed the scene, one officer approached Reese with a plastic sleeve. Inside was a torn page from a Bible, weathered and marked. Psalm 94:17. If the Lord had not been my help, my soul would soon have lived in the land of silence. Beneath it in red ink, someone had written, "He taught me silence, but I taught it to scream." That night, Reese stood outside the club, watching as the last crates were hauled into trucks. The neon sign had gone dark, but the memory of its glow still pulsed against the buildings. The church beneath the nightclub had fallen, but its echoes remained, and with them a trail, one built not of blood or bullets, but of voices once muted, now roaring through paper, through tape, through time. It was a voice no one expected, a call made from a payphone in Ciudad Juarez at the edge of the U.S.-Mexico border, 3:27 a.m. local time. The line was routed through an encrypted DEA trace, caught only because the device had been flagged months earlier in a cartel surveillance sweep. The caller gave no name. She didn't have to. The words were enough to freeze every agent listening on the other end. You think you found the dead girl in Oregon, but she wasn't the one meant to die. Then silence. Then, he sent her in my place. A pause, shallow breathing. He always knew I wouldn't make it to the end, but I made sure he wouldn't either. Then the line cut. No trace, no GPS ping, no second attempt. But Reese knew it was Marianne. For a moment, the entire case stood still. What had once been a linear investigation, a woman found dead, a trail of tapes, a house full of echoes, had become something else entirely. It was no longer a post-mortem. It was a chase, and the woman everyone thought was gone was not only alive, she was in control. They pulled traffic camera footage within a 2-mile radius of the payphone. The booth stood beside a rundown taqueria, its sign barely hanging by a thread. In the grainy black and white video, they saw her, a woman in a dark hoodie backpack slung low, slipping into the booth and holding the receiver with both hands as if it might vanish. Her face was obscured, but her posture, straight, firm, unafraid, was unmistakable. She wasn't running. She was sending a message. Reese rewound the tape over and over, studying every frame. Then she saw it. As the woman turned to leave, she passed a graffiti wall covered in layered tags, but one stood out, newly painted, bright red. A symbol, not a word, a choke collar drawn like a halo. Inside it, the letters MD. Marianne had marked the spot, like she'd done with the ring. With the letter, with the journal, with the church, one breadcrumb at a time. But the question remained, who had she become? Was she still a victim, or had she become something else? Her last call wasn't one of desperation. It was a warning. He sent her in my place. Emily had been a substitute, a proxy, Marianne's exit wound. And if Marianne was alive, that meant her silence had been strategy all along. Reese opened the full Interpol file on El Silencio. Aliases, border crossings, partial fingerprints, rumors of throat trauma sustained in a machete attack in Costa Rica 2014, believed to be operating out of Sonora, last confirmed sighting Panama 2 months prior. But if Marianne was in Juarez, then he wouldn't be far behind. because his ghosts always followed him, and Marianne had always been one of them until now. In a secret report from 2019, an undercover informant described the operational rules of El Silencio's trafficking model. The key component was narrative control. Every girl gets a backstory. Every girl becomes someone missing. It makes her harder to trace and easier to replace. But if the story failed, if the girl woke up, she became expendable. Emily had woken up. She tried to run. She was replaced. Reese reviewed every missing woman tied to the Petrosky alias. 9 names. 5 confirmed dead. 2 missing. 1 unverified. The unverified name, Anna Marie Beauchamp, disappeared from Vancouver in 2016. No family. No case. Just a brief note left behind in a hostel. I want to become someone else. That name, Beauchamp, matched one of the fake passports found in the house in Crescent City. But the date of entry into Mexico just 2 weeks before the phone call. Marianne hadn't just resurfaced. She'd crossed the border. She was close. That night, Reese spoke with Keane over a secure line. She's still writing the ending, Reese said quietly. Not writing, Keane corrected. Directing, Reese exhaled. You think she's trying to finish it? I think she already has, Keane said. And now she's making sure we know where to find the bodies. The next morning, Interpol received a package. No return address. No fingerprints. Inside a single Polaroid. It showed a hand bruised, gripping a necklace. The chain was unmistakable. A broken cross bent at the center, matching one listed in Emily Sorensen's personal effects when she first entered the Spokane shelter. On the back of the photo in red ink, tell the truth, or I will, MD. For Reese, it was no longer a matter of jurisdiction. It was a question of timing. Marianne wasn't just haunting the edges of this case. She was the case. She had become a voice inside the machine, leaking its secrets, drawing lines through countries, through girls, through every silence it had used as a weapon. And now, with one phone call, she had turned that silence back on its master. It ended not with a raid, not with gunfire or sirens or a high-speed chase. It ended in the way all deep-rooted rot does, slowly, silently, then all at once. 3 weeks after the payphone call in Juarez, a tip was submitted anonymously to the FBI's field office in El Paso. No name, no phone number, just a location, a small property in the desert west of Deming, New Mexico. Coordinates in one sentence. He'll be there, but not for long. They moved fast. When agents arrived, the trailer looked abandoned, rusted siding, blacked-out windows, no vehicle in sight. But inside, they found a man lying on a mattress, gaunt, unshaven, hands bound with surgical precision. Next to him, a voice recorder. The tape inside had no label, just a scratch mark, a crude initial M. They played it. You taught me that silence was power, that forgetting was freedom, that erasing women made them easier to sell, easier to bury. But I remembered everything. Your face, your rituals, the way you folded their lives into roles you rehearsed like theater. Now it's your turn. A pause, just long enough for breath. Try screaming. El Silencio was alive, but barely. He was transferred to a federal medical facility in Phoenix, guarded around the clock. He hadn't spoken, couldn't not, from the injury sustained, but from something else. A trauma far more surgical. No cameras had captured the assailant. No DNA found at the scene. No prints. Only a single Polaroid taped to the trailer wall. It showed a woman standing on a cliff at sunset, arms open, face turned away from the lens. Beneath it, a handwritten caption, "No one owns a ghost," signed MD. The aftermath was a reckoning. Dozens of women were identified from the documents found beneath the nightclub. Some were alive, scattered across borders, living under false names they never chose. Others had long since disappeared, their identities traded like currency. Interpol launched Operation Luminary, a cross-border task force aimed at dismantling trafficking networks that operated beneath religious and humanitarian fronts. The US and Canada reopened old cases, including Marianne Ducharme's. But when they tried to close it to declare her alive, they hit a wall. There was no proof, Only fragments, letters, voice recordings, notes, photographs, all suggesting life, all suggesting presence. But no one had seen her. Not really. Not since the call. Not since the girl in the phone booth. Reese submitted her final case report 6 weeks later. She labeled the file the Silence Directive. It included names, maps, evidence trails, and one closing paragraph. She never asked for justice, only truth, and the chance to leave her echo behind louder than the silence that tried to erase her. She didn't disappear. She diverged, and she took the system with her. Arthur Keene retired again for real this time. But before he did, he mailed Reese a package, the original sketch of Marianne, the one drawn from the cafe owner's memory years ago. Alongside it, a note. We were looking for the wrong girl the whole time. She wasn't lost. She was learning, and in the end she didn't just escape, she evolved. The press never got the full story. The headlines skimmed the surface: cartel network collapses in tri-national sting. Human trafficking ring tied to pseudo-religious front. But they missed the pulse underneath. They missed the woman whose silence had carried a war on its back. They missed the girl who disappeared twice and returned without asking permission. Somewhere in a city that doesn't speak her name, a woman boards a bus, hood up, eyes forward. In her hand, a book Les Miserables worn annotated. On the last page, a message is scribbled. She remembered. And so she lived. She smiles, not because she's free, but because she was never caught. And now the silence belongs to her, forever.